So Ann Herbert was minding her own business in a little cafe in Sausalito, California in 1982. She was just minding her own business, but she reached a tipping point in this moment that caused her to start writing, literally right there in this cafe, writing on a placemat, a paper placemat that was underneath her plate. She had become weary of all the violence and hatred and cruelty in the world around her. She had become worn out by reading again and again in headlines about random acts of violence and senseless acts of cruelty. She had hit a tipping point. So on that paper placemat, she turned that phrase that she had heard so many times, she turned it upside down and rewrote it. She wrote, "Practice random kindness and senseless acts of beauty." By simply replacing two words of violence and cruelty with words of kindness and beauty, Ann Herbert began a movement that some of you may recall. It became first bumper stickers. This was pre-internet. Bumper stickers. And then it became a book, and eventually a movie. Practice random kindness and senseless acts of beauty. I can remember exactly where I was when I saw the first bumper sticker. They were all black, and the lettering, the words were white. And it really struck me. And I remember thinking, I wonder if she's a person of faith. This woman that came up with this idea, to this day I still don't know, and she died about 4 years ago. But I can tell you that that phrase captures the essence of all of the lasting traditions. It captures the Islamic pillar of generosity. It captures the Buddhist metta prayer. It captures Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." The Apostle Paul picked it up in his great chapter. The kids, you can look this up, 1 Corinthians 13. Kids, go ahead, you can use your brand new Bible. 1 Corinthians 13. Anybody in the house know what that says about love? Love is patient and love is kind. Love apparently has multiple forms. Patience is love in waiting. Kindness is love in action. The Jewish concept of tikkun olam means the healing of the world. The same spirit of this idea to practice random kindness and senseless acts of beauty. So clearly it wasn't original to Ann Herbert, but she did her part in making it an everyday ambition for millions of people. Ann Herbert was in that way then a modern day prophet, like Micah of old. Micah just said it a little more succinctly. Love, kindness. Love, kindness. I think for lots of us, it's sort of like the gushy, yummy middle part of an Oreo for Micah, right? Do justice, love, kindness. Walk humbly with God, right? The either sides are kind of tough, but that loving kindness, like that's yummy. But it wasn't quite so simple for Micah. Remember, we're talking about real context here. There was a lot on the line for Micah and his people. It wasn't simply a matter of paying for the car behind him at the McDonald's drive-thru. It wasn't as simple as shoveling his neighbor's driveway, even if it was November. And it wasn't as easy as just pushing a quarter into a parking meter that had expired with a car still in its spot. Don't get me wrong, those are all good things, and we should do them as often as we can. But Micah used a word that doesn't translate easily into English. It's a Hebrew word, chesed. Chesed is such a complicated word and concept that you'll not find agreement among the rabbis or even among the biblical translators. I have a nifty little tool that'll lay out 4 or 5 translations, even more of the Bible, all in one screen on my computer. And when I go to Micah 6:8, there's at least 4 or 5 different versions. They don't all say love kindness. Some say love mercy. Others say loving loyalty. There's a lot of different versions because it's not super easy or clear. This idea of hesed is a sort of loving kindness. Like if we can make up a word, can we make up a word? Can we do that? We can do that, right? So if you just put loving and kindness all together in one word, loving kindness. I don't know, maybe it is a word. Sounds like it should be, right? That might get close. Loving kindness. It's a loyal love. It's a love that's expressed between people, but also between people and God, and between God and people. It's not about duty. It's not about coercion. It's certainly not about manipulation. But as Micah says, it is required of us. You can see how quickly this idea that's so simple on the surface becomes quite complicated. I think hesed, I think kindness in general, is a clear example of something that is simple but not easy. So in that direction, you'll be surprised to know that I have 3 ideas to share with you about kindness this morning. You'll be even more surprised to learn that all 3 of them start with the same letter. All right? Trying to make this as memorable, meaningful, and applicable to you as I possibly can. To love kindness is to make a choice. It's to recognize that it's costly, and to know that at the heart of it is the issue of character. So choice, cost, and character. I'll go through those one at a time. First of all, the idea that kindness is a choice. This might seem on the surface to be too obvious to include as an entire point in a sermon, that something is a choice. But let me ask you, what's the difference between doing something and not doing it? What's the difference between those two things? What's the difference between doing something and not doing it? It's a choice, I know, it seems so simple. But it's just that important that if we don't choose it, it won't happen. And by the way, kindness that happens by accident isn't kindness. It's just coincidence. It's just kind of lucky. That's not kindness. You don't get to take credit for something that happens by accident. Kindness of Micah's sort is a choice. And it's a choice that we make in response to a need that we see in the world. This week I read an author and a sociologist named Fred Falker. Fred has done some interesting work over the last 20 or 25 years as he's watched our culture become increasingly divided. And he asserts that it's not about difference, it is about distance. It's subtle, but it's a really important distinction. Difference versus distance. We aren't born with differences. We create those. We draw lines between us. We draw boxes around ourselves or around other people. Nature doesn't do that. Nature doesn't draw those lines, those boxes. And it's those very lines and those boxes that we draw that puts distance between us. You need only compare the interaction between a couple of 5-year-olds who are strangers to a couple of 55-year-olds who are strangers to see what happens over time as we draw lines of difference that create the distance that we feel so acutely. According to Falker, the move from seeing differences to the action of bridging the distance is a choice. We can see differences. We can recognize that distance. And we can act on that to bridge it. But it is an intentional choice that we have to make. Because we react to differences without thought, right? We walk into a room and there's somebody across the room, we don't know them. They look different from our first is a reaction. But when it comes to bridging distance, we respond rather than react. And when we respond, we're making a choice about what that response is going to look like. And that's when we get to choose loving kindness over and against any other sort of response. You might have heard, as I have, a frequent encouragement to do the next right thing. Have you heard this? Right? Somebody says, just let's do the next right thing. I think it's even been preached here by somebody who might look a little bit like me, right? Just a coincidence. Do the next right thing is a good idea, except the problem is what's right? Who gets to decide what's right? Because what's right for you might be wrong for me. It's too subjective. Kindness, on the other hand, kindness is universal. Kindness is always the right choice. How about we choose to do the next kind thing rather than the next right thing, the next kind thing, because it's very likely going to be the next right thing, and surely we can agree upon that. Anne Lamott put it simply. She said, you can either practice being right or you can practice being kind. It's an important distinction. And in either case, it's a choice. That's the first thing. To love kindness is an active choice that we have to make intentionally. Secondly, is that kindness is going to cost you. Kindness is costly. There's no way around it. There's no way to avoid it. Kindness will cost us. Now, this parable that Rustin read was a parable of Jesus. Jesus told that as a story. It's called the Great Reversal. That last line you probably heard Rustin read, it said, the last will be first and the first will be last. Typical, totally typical Jesus, right? Teaching with a story. It's hard to understand. What's it all about? He tells this story about the owner of a vineyard. And this owner of the vineyard hired people all day long, throughout the whole day. And at the very end of the day, when it was time to pay them, he paid all of them the same amount of money. It made no sense to the people that were there. And it really doesn't make a lot of sense in our minds and in our eyes, because he could have kept account of exactly how many hours each person worked and then paid them, right? He could have separated them according to their value and according to their merit, the things they did well and the places where they failed. He could have saved himself a ton of money and maybe invested that back into the business. But instead, he did something that was costly, and it was something that the people thought was crazy. This parable came to me this past week from two very different people in my life. One was a very young, successful, and wealthy business owner in this community who brought this parable to me because he was studying it. He was trying to learn from it for himself. The second person that brought this to me, not knowing that I was preaching on this, was my oldest son, Brady, who was preparing to actually preach on this same parable as part of a little college tour he was doing for the organization that he's serving. Now, you take these two very different individuals, the one young and wealthy business owner right here in Wayzata, he's the vineyard owner in the story, right? I mean, that's where he would see himself, right? And my oldest son, Brady, he in the story is probably one of those hired hands late in the day, right? Very different people, both seeking to learn from the same story, but in both cases, when it comes to the kindness that they were both seeking, it was going to be costly. For the former person, for the wealthy business owner right here in Wayzata, kindness is going to cost him. He's seeking to give away everything that he has. He's seeking to give away all of this money that he's worked so hard to achieve and to attain without compromising his family. He wants to give it all away. And we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars it's going to cost him to be kind. And for the latter, for my son, who's spending a year in Denver mentoring high school students at a charter school that was built for pregnant and parenting teenagers, it's going to cost him too. His kindness is going to cost him. He's having to pay for his own time there, and he's being paid a whopping $75 a month for his work. Kindness on both hands. It's costly. It's costly also because people look at that sort of kindness and they just think it's crazy. But in both cases, both men, remarkably kind men, both are choosing to respond to a need. Both are paying a price to be kind. While one was struggling to be the vineyard owner, the other struggling to be the hired hand, I had to remind them both. And it was a hard moment in both conversations. I had to remind them both, this is not all about you. This is all about God. Jesus said the kingdom of God is like. This is all about God's outrageous economy where everyone has everything they need. About God's gracious and generous and costly kindness toward all people. A kindness that keeps no account of merit or value. A kindness where scorekeeping is a dead end. And we're called to do the same. We are called, like Micah, to be like God, even when the world thinks we're crazy. Remember that lovely long poem by Mother Teresa, Do It Anyway? The second line in that, she says, if you are kind, people may accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Be kind anyway. Love that whole poem, but I love that one line. So to love kindness is a choice. To love kindness will cost you. Let me close with the idea that kindness is a mark of true and godly character. In your mind, I want you to think right now of somebody that you know and that you respect very much. I need you to get a name and a face. Somebody that you know, preferably personally, and that you respect very much, primarily for their character, just the kind of person they are. You got a name, you got a face? I'd be willing to bet that they're a very kind person. Conversely, think of somebody that you don't like. Think of somebody you don't respect. I'd be willing to bet they're not a very kind person. Kindness has the effect of both building and revealing character, of building and revealing a good and godly character. Thursday night, I arrived home late after my weekly paddle tennis game to catch the last 8 seconds of the NFL's game between the Cleveland Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, I hear the collective gasp in the room, so others must have seen this as well, and it was certainly all over the news, the melee that broke out at the end of the game. For me, it wasn't just the poor sportsmanship. For me, it wasn't just the violence of the fight that ensued. For me, it wasn't just the unimaginable act of somebody swinging a helmet at the head of another person. For me, I remember all that, but what I have not been able to get out of my mind's eye is the crowd of faces that were cheering these people on. And that when one of them left the field, they were lined up to give him a high five. What is going on? We are awash in violence. From sports that we revere to politicians that we used to revere. From video games that we put into our children's hands to the videos that we fill our own minds and hearts with. We are awash in violence, and we need to bring balance to that. And we can do that because for every single headline that we read about random violence or senseless acts of cruelty, there are countless examples of random kindness and senseless acts of beauty. I don't need the headlines to tell me what's really going on in the world. I just need to look around me, and we need to come together as a massive movement of loving kindness to balance all the rest of it out. That's our place in the world. That's how we get to be our best, not just today, but for all the days of our lives. That's how we imitate Jesus. Jesus, by the one who time and again just demonstrated a kindness that was like everyday and powerful. The moment after he said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you," he walked down off the mount and he touched the most untouchable person in his culture. He touched a leper. Wasn't a whole lot later, Jesus is walking on his way to do an act of loving kindness for a friend whose daughter was sick, and he stops the whole crowd and he asks, "Who touched me?" And then he acted with kindness toward a woman, total stranger. Jesus, the same one who walked through a town and saw the biggest sinner in town up in a sycamore tree, and he called him down. He said, "Let's go have dinner." Kindness after kindness after kindness. This is our call. This is who we are. I could go on and on with Jesus, but I'm out of time. Let me just close with an image that I borrow from David Brooks that has to do with character. In his book, Road to Character, some of you read it, he identifies two sets of virtues, right? The resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. Most of you are familiar with this. I'm just reminding you of this. It's a good place to close out. The resume virtues are the skills that you bring to the marketplace. The eulogy virtues are those ones that are talked about at your funeral. Whether you were kind, first thing on his list, whether you were kind and brave, honest and faithful. Because in the end, my friends, we will all have things spoken of us. We will all have final words spoken over our lives. We will all have a benediction about us and the life that we lived. What will yours be? You get to begin deciding that right now, today. And it will grow from the kindness that you choose, the kindness that you know is costly, and the kind of kindness that builds and reveals characters. So let's together follow the example. Let's heed the call of Micah. And let's take Ann Herbert's bumper sticker to heart. Practice random kindness and senseless acts of beauty. Amen.